Yeah, hello everybody. So let's get started. Welcome to our first N3AS Seminar this fall semester. We are glad to have Dr. Jeffrey Simpson as our speaker today. Jeffrey is an astronomer at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, and previously worked at Australian Astronomical Observatory. He is also a key member of a major Australian lab surveys of stars in our Milky Way galaxy. In this talk, he will tell us about astronomical resolution to the cosmological lithium problem. For the audience, please mute yourself during the talk. If you have any questions for Jeffrey, please indicate in the chat window or use the raise hand button. There is also going to be additional time for questions and discussion after the talk. All right, so Jeffrey, please go ahead.
Right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to speak. So before we begin, it's important for us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we virtually meet today. For myself here in Australia, these are the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I'm speaking with you today from the land of the Warramadigal clan of the Darug Nation. This land is unceded lands and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Peoples joining us here today. So as in the introduction, I am a sort of stellar astronomer. I come at this very much to talk to you today, all very much as a person who looks at stars and looks, I was going to say looks through a telescope, but I don't think I've actually looked through a telescope in a long time, and we never actually looked through telescopes. But I work with this big survey called GALAR, which I'm going to talk about today. And what I've published this paper on is the fact that we looked at stars that were accreted into a Milky Way, so stars that came into our galaxy from other galaxies, and we show that they actually also inhabit the lithium Spite Plateau, and that the cosmological lithium problem happens everywhere. So that's what I'm going to talk to you today about. So what I do is I work in a field of research known as galactic archaeology, which is these questions, trying to answer this question of how did our Milky Way galaxy form, and how did it grow, and how did it evolve? And so this field of research has really sort of exploded in the last 5 years with the Gaia mission, which is what's produced the background image here. So this is a space mission that is mapping our galaxy. It's produced a catalog of 1.3 billion stars, tells us where they are in the galaxy and their motions. And we're also combining this work with surveys like GALAR. So GALAR is a ground-based survey, acquiring spectra of stars in our galaxy. There is, it's one of many of these surveys. So there's GALAR in Australia, there is Apogee in the US, part of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, there's Gaia-RISO in Europe, there's LAMOST in China. All these surveys are looking at slightly different things, but basically collecting big collections of spectra. And so what I'm first of all discuss is GALAR. What is GALAR for those of you who aren't familiar? So first of all, this is a GALAR. Australian astronomers love to name their surveys after Australian animals. So this is the parrot about this big, these purple plumage. And so that is a GALAR. What is the GALAR survey? So the GALAR survey is galactic archaeology with Hermes. We're astronomers, so of course we have to have a very contrived acronym. So this is the one slide overview of GALAR. So it is a survey using the Anglo-Australian telescope, which is a 4-meter telescope here in Australia, that and with the Hermes spectrograph. So this is a high-resolution optical spectrograph, and we're acquiring spectra for 1 million stars. We have about 750,000 stars currently. In fact, we were observing last night. I'm not sure how successful they were. The robot was being a bit funny. So what we're doing is we're acquiring all these spectra. And what we're doing with these spectra is that we're measuring what the stars are made of. We're getting elemental abundances for up to 30 elements per star. And this is all done very automatically. And what we're trying to do with this information about what the stars are made of, and combining it with the information from Gaia about the motions of stars in the galaxy, is we're trying to do this thing called chemical tagging. And so what chemical tagging is we're trying to work out where stars were born. So we've got a view of the galaxy now, and we'd like to work out what it used to look like, where stars were when they started and how they've moved about the galaxy. And so one of the things you can do for this chemical tagging, which is basically that you take the elemental abundance pattern of a star, the amount of neodymium, the amount of carbon, the amount of oxygen, the amount of sodium, the amount of magnesium, all these different elements, and you say this acts as like a fingerprint or a DNA pattern for a star, and so you can try and work out stars that are siblings, stars that were born from the same cloud of gas. So that will be strong chemical tagging, really working out sibling stars. There's a much weaker chemical tagging, which is what I'm going to talk about today in this talk, which is to use sort of signatures that tell you stars came from certain broad categories of things, like these are stars that came from another galaxy, or these are stars that were in our galaxy already. So we have up to 30 elements per star, but what elements do we get? Now, we don't get all the elements of the periodic table. Some of this is for technical reasons, some of this is for you just run out of spectra. But this is a periodic table that was created for a paper by Shaki Kobayashi last year. And what is happening here is each little entry on the periodic table is a graph showing for Shaki's galactic chemical evolution model, with time where a particular element was formed. So for instance, you look at magnesium up here. At the start of the universe, there was no magnesium. And as the universe evolved, or the universe happened, you have core collapse supernova, and they contribute to magnesium. And then at some point, you get asymptotic giant branch stars happening. So stars like the sun puffing off, once a star like the sun evolves off the main sequence and becomes a giant star, and it starts puffing off its satellites. You have something like iron, where you have a core collapse supernova, and then you have type 1a supernova. There's a few that have the neutron star mergers stuff happening, like gold. So these are all the elements that you could possibly observe in the universe. The elements that we get in Galar are the ones here. So these are our 30-ish elements. What you see is that we're sampling lots of these different nucleosynthetic channels. So we're getting elements like barium and lanthanum that are from asymptotic giant branch stars. We're getting sodium, magnesium, which are core collapse supernova. We're getting our iron peak elements. So by doing this, we're able to sample all of these different nucleosynthetic channels to really do the chemical tagging well, because you can't just rely on one element to do, say, strong chemical tagging. So this is what we're trying to do. This is what we've actually done. So this is our beautiful abundance set from our data release 3 paper. This was a huge amount of work led by Sven Buda, who is now at ANU. So what these are plots of the iron, they're all actually against the iron abundance of a star. And then the y-axis is the element. So this one in the bottom left is zinc. So this is the zinc abundance against the iron abundance of stars. And these are scattered density plots. So where it is yellower, there are more stars at that position. And so this is sort of 10 years worth of work and countless PhDs, postdocs, faculty, people's lives, so much money spent. And here are 27 panels that is basically all of Galar. It is a beautiful set of abundances. And this is sort of the whole of galactic chemical evolution. This is a history of our galaxy here. And so what I'm going to do is just talk about one element. I'm going to talk about lithium, because lithium is the only element that matters. So lithium, you can see, has this very complicated pattern with iron abundance. There's sort of these 2 lines of stars here. You can see over densities of stars, all sorts of things happening. So lithium is this very complicated element because it was formed in the Big Bang. So unlike every other element we get in Galar, or apart from, we don't get hydrogen, helium, they're too hard. Lithium is the one element we observed that was formed in the Big Bang. So it's very fragile in stars. It's not kind of easy to make in stars. So it's trying to understand how you form this pattern. And the thing I'm interested in, or was interested in for this paper that I wrote, was trying to answer a thing that goes all the way back to the 1980s, which was way back in the 1980s. Speed and Spite published this seminal paper where they went and measured the amount of lithium in 10 old stars in the halo of our galaxy. And they discovered what was known as the Spite Plateau. And so what we have here is this observation that with metallicity of star, the iron abundance of a star, all of these stars have the same lithium abundance for a very large range of metallicity. And so all old stars have the same lithium abundance. And the interpretation you can take from this is that this is the primordial lithium abundance of the universe. This is the amount of lithium that the galaxy, this is the amount of lithium that the universe started with. Then there hasn't been much happened to the lithium abundance of these stars before, of the gas before these stars formed. And so all these stars are forming with the amount of lithium the universe produced by the stars. Now we have an observation. What can we make a prediction? And so this is where Big Bang nucleosynthesis comes along. And so this lets you make a prediction of the amount of hydrogen and helium and lithium and beryllium, but beryllium, no stellar astronomer cares about beryllium because you need Hubble time and the UV to try and observe it. So we don't care about beryllium. So this lets you make predictions. You take your cosmology and your Big Bang nucleosynthesis, Big Bang stuff and your cosmic microwave background and your nuclear physics, and you throw it into a black box and you produce these likelihood functions of how much hydrogen 2, helium 4, helium 3, and lithium 7 you would produce in the Big Bang. And so where does the observation sit? So this is where the observations are. So deuterium and helium 4 work really well. They match really well to the predictions. Lithium 7 does not. Lithium 7 was way different. And so this is the cosmological lithium problem. This has been a problem for a long time and has had lots of proposed solutions to it. And people have made up more observations of stars and they keep getting the Spite Plateau. People have played around with the nuclear physics. They do all sorts of things to try and make these two curves come together, and we just cannot make them come together. They just won't. And so this is what's known as the cosmological lithium problem. So I was interested in a sort of interesting solution to the problem, which is whether the cosmological lithium problem is in fact cosmological. And so what I mean by this is that in order to make this measurement of the lithium in dwarf stars like Spite and Spite, you need to make this measurement in dwarf stars. You don't do it in giant stars because once a star becomes a giant star, they deplete and destroy their lithium. They become very well mixed. The lithium is very fragile. It gets mixed into interior parts of the star where it can be burned into turned into other elements. As I've got an asterisk there are lithium-rich giants, which are a fascinating topic. I've written a paper with my boss, Sarah Martell, on this, and we're working on more things about this. So lithium-rich giants are a thing, but they're a completely different kettle of fish. So we need to, in order to measure lithium, to measure the Spite Plateau, to look at the cosmological lithium problem, you do it in dwarf stars. The problem is that dwarf stars are just too faint to observe in other galaxies with our current suite of telescopes. With the upcoming 30-meter class telescopes, we're probably going to be able to start doing this in things like the Large Mansion Light Cloud, maybe, so the dwarf galaxies around the Milky Way, we might be able to start getting dwarf stars with a good enough signal to start doing this measurement. But for the moment, we're just stuck with the stars in our galaxy. So what I was interested in was sort of saying, okay, instead of trying to go to the other galaxies to make this observation, let's bring the other galaxy stars to us. So this is not it sort of seems like it's a kind of a nonsense phrase, but it isn't, in the sense that we know that galaxies, the paradigm of how you form a Milky Way-like galaxy is by accretion and assembly, minor and major mergers. So these animations here are from the Fire 2 simulations of Milky Way-like galaxies being formed. You can see that they're very violent places over time. There's lots of dwarf galaxies coming in, being pulled apart, scattered everywhere. And so what we know and think is that our galaxy is just full of stars from other galaxies. And so can we find these stars in our galaxy and measure their lithium? Now, what we've been able to do recently with the Gaia data is Gaia has really brought into focus and allowed us to identify these stars. So we sort of knew these stars existed, but trying to find large enough samples of them and come up with some convenient tag on them was a bit difficult. So, but what Gaia has let us do is that Gaia has now given us the opportunity to work out the orbits for stars, all these stars in our galaxy. So for every star in Gaia, we have an orbit. And what I'm plotting here are two looks at our galaxy. One is the reality from Gaia, and one is a model of the galaxy that you sort of create a mock catalog of the galaxy, and is produced by a piece of code called Galaxia, which is written by Sanjit Sharma here in Sydney. And we're plotting LZ versus square root JR, and these are just measures of the orbital properties of stars. So LZ is the Z component of the angular momentum, and square root JR is a measure of the radialness of the eccentricity of the orbit. So for context, the sun sits at like 2, 0 on here. So the sun is way down here because it has a very circular in the plane orbit. And if you model the galaxy as having this very smooth isotropic halo of stars, this big ball of tenuous stars around the disk, and it's nice and smooth and isotropically homogeneous, then what you don't get are stars here. You don't get a lot of stars up here. But what we actually observe is a lot of stars up here. And this has been dubbed the Gaia sausage enceladus, which is a horrendous name that is the result of many groups. There was 2 different groups discovered this in different ways. And one of them offhandedly, I'm pretty sure, just called it the sausage because it looked like a sausage in their plot they were making. They didn't discover it in this particular parameter space. They discovered a different parameter space. And it looked like a sausage, and so they called it the sausage. And so it sort of just ends up being called the sausage. But anyway, so we observe all these extra stars in Galar. Oh, so we observe all these stars in the universe, in our galaxy, and we get them in Galar as well. This is a raised hand.
Yes, George, please go ahead.
Thank you. So very nice. So do I take it that the stars in the sausage have eccentric orbits?
Yes, so they're highly eccentric orbits, like sort of if on the eccentricities are like 0.9 and larger.
Right. So they're mostly just plunging orbits, and they're not confined to the plane, right?
Yes, they're sort of all, yeah, they're in the halo, so they're all sorts of all sorts of inclinations.
Thanks.
Yeah. So these are stars that, so yeah, what we think has happened is that you had the Gaia sausage enceladus was a large Magellanic cloud-sized dwarf galaxy that came into our galaxy about 5-6 gig years ago. I've lost that time frame in my mind. It came into the galaxy, got pulled apart by the galaxy, has been spatially mixed in the galaxy. So these stars aren't clumped in some part of the galaxy anymore, but we haven't had enough time to dynamically mix them into the galaxy. So they still have the remnants of these very eccentric orbits. So it sort of came plunging in. So we have this kinematic tag to identify stars that formed in another galaxy. And now we can look at the chemical tag on these stars. So what I did in the paper was to pick stars up here. These are Gaia sausage stars up here in this part of the plane, and this LZ square JR thing. And then you make a selection of stars over here, which are other halo stars, stars that have more typical, they've probably formed with our galaxy. And you can look at the abundances of these stars, and in particular looking at the iron versus magnesium plane. And the reason we look at magnesium, if I bring back the periodic table, is lots of things, because I keep looking for magnesium in the wrong place when I was practicing this talk, so I put the thing here. And magnesium sits up here, and you see that magnesium has a very big contribution from core collapse supernova. And that's important because core collapse supernovae start going off the moment you form a galaxy. They form from massive stars exploding. These happen in such instantaneous timeframes that they just start happening straight away. And so what happens is that you keep these core collapse supernovae going off, they're producing magnesium. At the same time, the stars are depleting magnesium, but the sort of competition between those two things keeps magnesium at a steady state, or roughly steady state. And so you see for the Milky Way stars, they sort of run at about a constant magnesium with metallicity. If you think of iron abundance or metallicity as a proxy for the age. In a lower mass system, the magnesium abundance starts going down at a metallicity because at some point the type 1a supernovae start happening. These are exploding white dwarfs. And so you explain white dwarfs, they happen at a certain point, and in a lower mass system, you need fewer type 1a supernovae going off to reduce the magnesium abundance of the galaxy. Hopefully that makes sense. Basically, trust me, this is a chemical tag that the Gaia sausage stars that go down like this are from a different galaxy than the red ones that go like this. So near the end of my talk, I finally get to the point, which is, okay, we have two samples of stars that come from different galaxies. What do the Spite plateaus of these two things look like? They look exactly the same. So what we're plotting here are the iron abundance of stars against their lithium in this particular scale. The background is all of Galar. So you see most of the stars we get in Galar are solar metallicity stars. They're sort of just stars that look like the sun. The Big Bang prediction is up here, and the Spite Plateau for our Gaia-associated stars and our other halo stars, just exactly the same. So this tells us that there isn't any evidence that galactic chemical evolution plays a role in the cosmological lithium problem. That the fact that the Big Bang value is up here and all these stars are down here is not something about the galaxy doing this. Now, this was kind of just, I was hoping I'd find something that would, just blow open all the Big Bang nucleosynthesis and show everything was wrong. Unfortunately, it didn't, which is a bit disappointing. So what do we think is happening with the cosmological lithium problem in terms of what we can say of this from stellar astronomy and Galar in particular? So there was a paper that actually came out before mine from Galar. So funnily enough that someone actually basically showed what the answer was before I wrote my paper, which was to look at this thing called the lithium dip. So on the top left panel here, we're plotting the dwarf stars we observe in Galar, and we're plotting their effective temperature against their surface gravity. So this is a classic HR diagram. It's not an HR diagram. HR diagrams plot slightly different things, but this is an HR diagram for the purposes here. And so you've got the dwarf stars here, and then the turn-off and the giant sequence. And then in the bottom left panel, I'm just plotting the stars that we observe in Galar that we can measure a lithium abundance for. So we have this one lithium spectral line in our Galar spectra. And what you find is that broadly the same morphology holds, that you see dwarf stars and you see giant stars in the turn-off. But you get this curious gap. So this is a region of the temperature and gravity space. So basically a mass, a particular stellar mass, where we can't observe the lithium line. These stars don't have a measurable lithium abundance. They've just got rid of the lithium. And so this is a real thing. This isn't like there aren't stars there are stars there. Like there are stars of this mass. It's just that particular mass, all of the mixing processes in a star just perfectly aligned to basically mix this material really well and mix the lithium, the surface material into the interior of the star and burn the lithium. And this is known as the lithium dip. And so what Zhudong looked at was to look at stars on either side of this, because stars up here have different these are more massive stars than these stars down here. And so what Zhudong did was to select a sample of stars up here and to select a sample of stars down here. And what they noticed was that the Spite Plateau is just made up of these cool stars. All these stars here are from this part, they're cooler stars, they're not over this hot side. And all the hot stars, sorry, I should say the hot stars, the red triangle, the red stars up here, stars within the red triangle are the red stars over here on the right-hand plot. The blue, green, teal things are the blue, green, teal things over here. And so the cool stars form the Spite Plateau, and we don't see these hot stars on the Spite Plateau. And the other thing that was noted, which was interesting, was that there's basically this consistent 0.4 Dex offset between these two sequences here. And so what you can imagine is that, this sequence for the cool stars runs nicely along, ticks along, and this runs into the Spite Plateau. And for the hot stars, it runs through here, and then we just don't get hot stars, but it runs kind of consistently into the Big Bang value, the orange bar, the gold bar. And so the interpretation we took from this is that, so the Spite Plateau is a consequence of stars doing something to their lithium when they're born. So the stars are born with the Big Bang value. These stars were born with the Big Bang value up here, but they very quickly depleted the lithium in the star when it was born. So in this very consistent about 0.4 Dex amount on the scale. And so if we were able to look at the galaxy 10 gig a year ago or something. So it's just, yeah, so if we were able to look at the galaxy a long time ago, when these hot stars, which are going to be more massive stars, were still around over here, then we would actually probably be filling in the space, that there would just be this continuous distribution of stars between the Big Bang value down to the Spite Plateau. And so it's only that because we're observing the galaxy now, and all of these hot stars, which are more massive stars, which are shorter lived stars, have evolved off the dwarf sequence and they now make giant stars. We don't observe them there. So this sort of fits in with the current paradigm, current thinking of the Spite Plateau. Spite Plateau was not a consequence of problems with Big Bang nucleosynthesis or the cosmological lithium problem. Spite Plateau, no consequence of problems with Big Bang nucleosynthesis or we need exotic physics or all sorts of things. It's just that stars have been annoying, that the stars have got rid of the lithium and we're observing the universe at a particular time frame, and we've just been confused by stars. So that will bring me to my summary slide, which is that, you know, the glass, so I've been talking about the glass survey, which is the survey that's been observing 1 million stars in our galaxy, or trying to observe 1 million stars. We're up to about 750,000. And we're getting lots of elemental abundances of lots of stars. In particular, we get the lithium abundance. And combining this with information from the Gaia Astrometric mission, we're able to slice and dice our sample into different kinematic populations in the halo, and we see that the cosmological lithium problem exists everywhere. It happens in other galaxies. And that really what we think is happening is that the Spite Plateau is a consequence of stars just depleting their initial birth lithium abundance. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for this interesting talk. And there is a comment by George earlier.
Yeah, thank you for a very, very nice talk.
Thanks.
This is really interesting. So, you know, the usual lore that we learn at our mother's knee is that, the Spite Plateau is a consequence of it's pristine material on the surfaces of those stars because they're hot and the surface convection zone is shallow, so that you're not mixing that material down, deep enough where it gets burned up. And it doesn't have to be very deep, right? I mean, a temperature of 100 electron volts will probably do it. Yeah. Right? Lithium-7 p alpha alpha. So you're saying that your kind of hypothesis here is that that's a misleading argument, because we're looking at the structure of those stars at the current epoch and not when they were born. So when they were born, there was something that mixed that surface material down to where it was hot, and it was destroyed by a factor of 3 or 4.
Yeah, so there's some work by Fu, and I can't remember their first name, where they sort of make some, there is a paper that looks at theoretically in terms of, it's very much happening at sort of the very pre-main sequence phase, that there's actually a complicated function. They produce a model, which is that there's depletion happening in the pre-main sequence phase, that they're taking the surface material and depleting it, but actually you get some reaccretion happening onto the star from the gas it formed from that brings the lithium back up. It's not just the stars themselves depleting, there is actually some reaccretion to bring it back up to some value, because otherwise they probably would get rid of too much. And yeah, so that's the consequence of, I come back to this slide. So it's some of it is a consequence of the temperatures of the stars we were looking at. So if we could measure the Spite Plateau, look at the lithiums of old stars that were the hotter side of things, then we probably things would be different. So these stars have the sort of canonical thin convective zone, aren't doing any mixing. These stars are doing it, whereas these stars that are on the cooler side of this lithium dip are doing a wee bit of mixing, just enough to get rid of things. And it's just, yeah.
But also there's a metallicity issue here, right? I mean, the classic Spite Plateau stars are fairly low metallicity compared to solar. So that means, I guess, lower opacity. And maybe these stars that you're pulling in from accreted, dwarf galaxies, for example, have an even lower metallicity. Is there some trend with, or am I looking at that trend on that slide you're showing me?
So this is the metallicities of the star. So in terms of Gaia sausage, what you find is that the stars basically stop at a metallicity of just below -1. So that looks to be about the point that the galaxy came in and just, what would say, the star formation was quenched, that the thing came in at the point that it only just got to that. So yes, all the stars that we have in these dwarf galaxies are within Galar. It's hard to tell that they're actually any lower metallicity than the Milky Way, because Galar has this sort of, we can't really get stars below about -2.5, just because our spectra don't work that well below then, just from
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very, very nice.
The next question is from Brian, please.
Yeah, so Jeffrey, thanks for your talk. Definitely very interesting. So I guess my question is a little bit like George's. So relating to the issue of this temperature range and whether you're missing these hot stars. Or I guess you're missing the hot stars because they don't exist anymore. They're too high mass. But as I recall, there's actually sort of two Spite plateaus. There's what you show here is there's a plateau versus metallicity, which is the thing that that leads you to believe that lithium is primordial. But there's the Spites also plotted the lithium abundance versus temperature versus surface temperature, and above whatever it is, like 5,600 Kelvin or something like that, there's a plateau that is, they all seem to be the same, but at low temperatures, then there's this big drop off in lithium, which leads to what George was talking about, the increased depth of the convection zone. And so when people plot, you're trying to get the primordial abundance, plot the Spite plateau, you always carefully select according to surface temperature. So is that done here in the ones you're plotting?
Yeah. So there's a lot of, as always in these talks, there's lots of details glossed over.
Sure, no, of course.
Yeah, I would say that was like months of my life trying to work out the best selections and temperatures and things. Yeah, there's plots of temperature versus lithium and gravity versus lithium, and yeah, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it was sort of 5850 was the number we settled on, that the stars had to be hotter than that, because yes, what you find is that as the stars become gravity, I think of it as the stars become higher and lower gravity, which is effectively higher and lower temperature. Yeah, the lithium abundance drops off quite dramatically, which is the deepening of the convective zone. So yeah, it's one of these things you have to be very careful about, is selecting stars that are hot enough that they aren't self-depleting lithium more than you want them to.
Right. Cool. And I guess the other thing I wanted to ask is, I guess particularly the plot where you show the other plot versus metallicity, it's a little more clear.
Which one? Was it this one?
I guess the other direction. Where you just showed the plateau. I guess that one. Yeah. So one of the puzzles about the Spite plateau is that the dispersion is very small, and if they're born with different rotation rates and so forth, it's surprising that you get such a small dispersion. But here you actually see some that are at the plateau level, which generally you don't find, and even some that are above. So is anything special about those, the ones that are high?
It's always good when someone looks, because there's never enough time to talk about these things.
Sure, no, go ahead.
Yeah, so some of this, at least one, like I've looked at these in detail, at least one of these stars I think is sort of just on the cusp of a signal to noise cut we have. And so I think it's, if you look at the spectra, is basically, it just had some noise that went down instead of up. And so the automated abundance measurement sort of thinks it has a stronger line. One of them is an equally degenerate problem in the analysis related to, or the rotation rate versus metallicity versus temperature are all slightly degenerate things. And so you can, I think in this case, the automated code decided to make it a slightly more faster rotating star, which meant that the lines can be stronger for a given temperature or whatever. So it may be spurious, but a couple of them are definitely very strong, obvious lithium lines. And so one of the things we propose or suggest, hypothesize in the paper, that these are potentially binaries, that is binary mass transfer from that they've just been dumped. They've got an AGB companion that's dumped on a bunch of lithium, and they do have the. There's one now. I'm trying to think. I think they have the right S process thing happening then as well. That they have a large S process element abundance happen as well, which you would expect if it was an AGB mass transfer. Because one of the other things that I haven't talked about in this, which is interesting, is the galactic, sort of the chemical evolution of a galaxy. And so in the same way that I was talking about the magnesium abundance going down when the type 1a supernova start happening, the lithium, as you can see, doesn't sit on the Spite Plateau forever. Once you get to stars like the sun, all sorts of stuff starts happening. And there's big spread out, it starts to spread out. And so what this is then you actually are able to start producing lithium in your galaxy via novae. And so the novae should be happening at a similar metallicity / age as the type 1a supernova, because they're sort of the same mass stars vaguely. And so what's actually surprising in the Gaia sausage stuff is that you don't see a sort of upturn in lithium happening, that there seemingly wasn't enough time in Gaia sausage before it came into the galaxy for you to start forming lots of stars with high lithium abundances at a lower metallicity than you would expect that you find in the Milky Way. So that was actually somewhat surprising, because what we were interested in part of the paper was whether you could start seeing, whether you could explain these stars that are up here as just being a natural consequence of lithium production happening in the galaxy. But it doesn't seem to be from, it's a much lower metallicity than you would expect. It should be sort of happening at 0.1 or something, and these are much lower metallicity.
Interesting. Cool. Well, thanks a lot. Really great stuff.
There is a question that David put in the chat. He's asking, are there any ideas what is killing lithium?
In terms of the sort of difference between for the hot versus cool stars.
David, would you like to ask yourself? You are muted.
I mean, I'm just going to guess that it's in terms of what we think is basically happening is that it's a convection mixing on these stars, that these stars are mixing the surface material down into the interior. And there was discussion just before, you actually don't need to get the material very deep into the star to destroy the lithium. Lithium has a destruction temperature. It doesn't have a very high destruction temperature. And so you don't need to get like down into the core or anything. You just need to get a wee bit into the star and get to 1,000,000 degrees or something, like 1,000,000 Kelvin or something. It's not a very, is that the right number? It doesn't have to get very high. And so you don't actually have to get the material very deep. So you need a wee bit of mixing happening. And so this is sort of what happens with this lithium dip, is just that these stars at this particular mass, just the mixing works really well. They're just mixing the surface material so well that they just get rid of all the lithium. But this is why lithium is a very complicated element. It's the one element that we get in Galar that it's no other element does this. Carbon and nitrogen do it a wee bit, but there basically shouldn't be any change to the amount of elements across the lifetime of a star on the surface. Lithium, there will be changes to the surface lithium abundance.
Great. So Yon, you are the next.
All right, very nice talk. I would like to understand a bit about this particular slide you're showing regarding the hot stars. I mean, you basically say that there are very few of them, but they do show up actually on your plot. I'm just thinking that would there be chances of having more observational runs so that you can have more such stars showing up? So you can see that really there are quite a few of stars lining up with the Big Bang value, right? I mean, you mentioned that some of the stars were kind of observational issues with whatever their signal to noise not so good, etc., etc. but there are quite a few of them sort of like on this plot, it's sort of like clutching that Big Bang value. I mean, would there, be more observations, try to really to tell that there will be actually real stars with those particular values aligned with the Big Bang prediction?
So I would guess, so the selection of these stars was very literally like this triangle. This triangle is anything within this triangle was made a hot star. And so some of what's going to be happening, I would guess, is that some of this is going to be spurious measurements, that these are not really stars that have those temperatures and gravities and those metallicities, because the time frames aren't going to work. That if something really was that metallicity, and I mean, I have no idea what temperature and gravity this particular star is here, if it was really that set of values, whether it should still be around. It may or may not still be around, because it should be like 1.2 solar masses and that, or 1.3 solar masses or whatever, and it shouldn't exist anymore if it formed 10 gigayears ago or something. I mean, things that are that mass shouldn't exist anymore. In terms of signal, yes, the survey is ongoing, and in fact, we're sort of upping the signal to noise on a bunch of our stars. Unfortunately, these particular stars aren't our primary target. The primary target we have in Galah now are main sequence turn-off stars, because they're the stars we can get ages for really well. And so these are stars that sit up about here in this parameter space. They're not down here. And they're also, this metallicity isn't really what we care about. I mean, this was a very serendipitous 1% of our survey kind of science. Well, not serendipitous, but these stars make up about 1% of our sample. So you get very few of them, unfortunately. What would be good to do, and so Zhudong is working on a follow-up paper, is to do a lot more modeling on this to really understand whether this picture is correct.
Okay, very nice. The other thing I want to mention, just to ask you that maybe that this is out of the question, at some point people try to look at lithium-6, the isotopic, basically partner of lithium-7, which mostly this lithium is, right? So is there any chance for you to do isotopic things to see the lithium content?
Definitely not with the Hermes spectra. Hermes is a spectral resolution of 28,000, so way not strong. The separation, I think, is tiny. I'm not an expert in this to know. I think the answer is it's very difficult to make that measurement. Lithium-6 versus lithium-7, because I see there's a question. There's also a question in the chat about lithium-6, and I'm sort of observing it. Lithium-6 versus lithium-7 is an interesting question for the other thing I briefly mentioned, which was these lithium-rich giants, because there's different competing models about this, where if you could distinguish between the lithium-6 and the lithium-7, it tells you things about formation mechanisms. So unfortunately, no, it's not something we can get with our spectra. And you need very high resolution, and I can't remember how high resolution you need. And then it's a question of how much telescope time you need for that.
Yeah, I remember there's also issues regarding the, other effects which mimicking that particular line, which is only slightly shifted from lithium-7 because of turbulence or something else that would just mock it up and all that. You need 3D models of the atmosphere rather than just a simple 1D. But that's a very good diagnostic about this depletion mechanism, right? Because lithium-6 burns a lot easier than, relatively speaking, a lot easier than lithium-7, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
I think Susan, you are next.
Oh, thank you. So that was a great talk. Thank you very much. I have I guess two simple questions. One concerns my recollection from some of the exotic resolutions for this problem, that when I saw the comparison of the Spite, I guess, Plateau versus the BBM predictions of some 10 plus years ago, that I got the impression that the thickness of the two bands were rather comparable. Today, when I see the current plot from Gao et al., one has the impression that the thickness of the BBN prediction is much sharper, and that the current Spite Plateau was a fatter object than we would have thought in the past. Do you agree that you see more dispersion in your new plateau than in the very old results where there are only a few halo stars?
Yes, so this definitely has a bit of a dispersion, and I would say that this is it's a methodology result in the sense that Galara's is very automated. We've got 600,000 stars. We're not doing this in any bespoke by hand looking at the spectra by eye kind of analysis, which is what you would want to do to get the errors down. So basically this is just errors driven by throwing this at a lot of CPUs and a lot of spectroscopy made easy routines to give us an answer. So it's, and the spectra that we're using are not, the metallicity of the stars we're looking at with Galar and Hermes, these are low metallicity stars with respect to the bulk of the sample we're using. In terms of the Big Bang value, that Big Bang value has definitely got narrower just because the measurements are better. Yeah, the measurements have got better because Planck and whatever is much better than Kobe.
My point is just that since you would like to suggest to us that there's a stellar resolution to this nominally cosmic lithium problem, that the result you show being fatter in dispersion is in support of that idea. I was just wondering if you would agree with that thought. So, yeah.
This definitely would want to be looking. I would say that we would want to look at the spectra. Properly isn't the right term, but just look at everything by eye and try to understand how much of the scatter is driven by the methodology versus intrinsic scatter. So one of the things I haven't shown here is there's all sorts of things that happen once you get to even lower metallicities like this. The Spite Plateau doesn't stay as a Spite Plateau. In fact, stars start to have really low lithiums, like it sort of falls off in lithium. All sorts of things start happening at much lower metallicity that aren't obvious.
Like maybe a consequence of your search algorithm, as you want to suggest, maybe. So, but I have a separate, really simple question. Of course, the sausage has splashed across the headlines, but there have been discoveries of other intruder galaxies as well. Maybe not as large and significant as Gaia Enceladus, but there's the Sequoia, I guess the Sequoia object also. And I guess I can't help but wonder, is it possible to look at, say, the ancient stars of other intruder populations and just see whether or not how the Spite plateaus might shape up in there as well? Is that observationally possible?
Yeah, so that's definitely something. So there's another large survey I'm involved with called S5, which I think your group or some of this group had a talk from Ting Li about. So this is looking at these are looking at spatially coherent structures, like stellar streams in the Milky Way. And so there is a paper that's looked at one of these streams. So these are dwarf galaxies that have been pulled apart and they haven't become well mixed yet. There's still this line of stars in the halo. And they did actually look at the lithiums of a handful of dwarf stars and they get the Spite Plateau value in these things. The difficulty you have more generally with something like Gaia sausage and the Sequoia is just selecting the stars. It isn't obvious that, I drew a box in parameter space and that isn't going to be the right answer because things don't have nice straight line edges in orbital parameter spaces. So there's actually a paper by Sven Buda, who is our lead in our data analysis that came out a couple of days ago, where he basically looks at all these different selections in terms of dynamics and chemical space, try and work out what the right stars are to do the selection. And so yes, there's definitely a topic of research to try and measure the lithium. Something I want to do is measure the lithium in some of these stream stars and other populations in the galaxy to try and see if we get the same answer everywhere. Because yes, this was only one dwarf galaxy, but it was an improvement on the one galaxy we were looking at previously. The other thing I would comment about this is that it was probably, if the cosmological lithium problem could be solved by just invoking chemical evolution in different galaxies, we probably should have seen that already, because the halo of our galaxy is full of stars that came from other galaxies. So the Spite Plateau wouldn't be this nice narrow Spite Plateau if this was the answer, because you would expect a scatter from all these different galaxies just built into it. And so this was probably what I'm showing here is not an unexpected result.
Very good. Okay. Thanks
There's
for
a
clarifying.
Sorry. There is a question by Carl in the chat. Did you observe lithium-6?
So yeah, I talked about lithium. Unfortunately, we can't get lithium-6.
And another question from Jeff. Out of curiosity, is it known or clear which side of the lithium deep the original Spite stars occupy?
In terms of, so I come back to my plot somewhere. So where these stars are?
Yeah, so I mean in this, the temperature, surface, gravity space. I imagine that if given that they show this reduced abundance, it would be very likely that they would be in the cooler, on the cooler side. But just
yeah, they're definitely in the cooler side. And yeah, I did look into this because actually what I was interested in was whether they just happen to be Gaia sausage stars. They happen to be very disky stars actually, because I was curious to see whether the Spite and Spite Plateau originally maybe just accidentally had solved this problem already. But no, they're definitely, there's, I can't remember the temperatures now, but they're definitely in the right temperature range, but they're cool stars. They're not, none of them are hot stars.
Okay, cool, great, thanks, appreciate it.
Baha, you are the next.
Yeah, this you may not have the answer to this question, but I'll ask anyway. Lithium-7 is a rather complicated atom, unlike all the other elements that we observe in BBN. And there are a number of assumptions, atomic physics assumptions, where in converting the observations into the abundances. How well those assumptions are understood? Is it possible that something may not be exactly correct with those assumptions?
I would say probably. I mean, one of the things I would say is that the analysis that we're doing in Galar is we're doing 1D non-LTE modeling of stars. So we're assuming the stars are one-dimensional objects, and that, or actually we're doing the analysis in local thermodynamic equilibrium, and then applying just a correction to the abundances to make them non-LTE. So the things are probably not exactly right, but everyone's kind of getting the same answers.
Is there a sense of what the dispersion of understanding there is, like what the error is in atomic, say, oscillator strengths and so on? I don't have any sense.
I don't know, unfortunately, what the, yeah.
I mean, lithium-7 is a rather complicated atom.
Yes.
And whether electrons are stripped or not will make a big difference. It's unlike any other nucleus that we observe in BBN. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know I don't know what the main driver is of any uncertainty in these sort of inputs and the analysis.
Well, thank you. This was a very nice talk. It's not your expertise, but I was curious.
No, sorry.
Okay, there's a last comment by Brian in the chat. I'll just read it out. In a dedicated study, the lithium plateau was shown to be very narrow in this metallicity range, but at very low metallicities, there is a huge scatter, and it's not clear why there is such a difference in these two metallicity regimes.
Yeah.
So I think this is about Jeff's previous question.
Yeah. So basically the scatter that we're getting at our Spite Plateau is probably driven primarily by the analysis. It's not an intrinsic scatter. And if you did this very well with very high signal, high resolution spectra, you get a much narrower Spite plateau.
Can I ask a question?
Prakash, yes, please.
Could you put up your last slide, the conclusion slide? Yeah, in the middle panel, you refer to kinematic populations where cosmological problems still exist. So my question is, could you please elaborate on what those kinematic populations actually means, simply because I don't have any formal training in astronomy.
So what I mean by this is just in terms of, if I come back to the sort of idea of selecting stars in their orbits. That's what I mean by the kinematic population. So these stars have different, what I actually did in the paper was not just select stars here and select stars here, but we selected stars on this arm of the distribution and some stars down in the disk. So we looked at all these different orbital stars, selecting stars from different orbital properties. So stars that had very eccentric orbits, stars that had much more disk-like orbits, all sorts of different orbits in the galaxy. And we saw the same Spite plateau. That's what that statement was saying.
Thanks. What sport do you follow?
A bit of cricket.
Ah, my mate. Good for you.
Great, very nice. It has been 1 hour, and yeah, I think it's time to conclude. Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for this excellent talk, and everyone for coming and for excellent questions. So we'll upload slides and recording of the seminar to our website. So yeah, see you next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.